T-minus 15 seconds and counting.
10.
10 seconds. We have go for main engine start. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Booster ignition and liftoff of Shuttle Discovery. Combate Kudasai. Best of luck to the International Space Station's newest laboratory.
Houston, Discovery, roll program.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Houston now controlling the flight of Discovery, a man-made rising sun on behalf of Japan. Discovery on the proper alignment, heads down, wings level for the 8.5-minute ride to orbit. 4.5 million pounds of hardware and humans taking aim on the International Space Station. "36 seconds into the flight, the 3 liquid fuel main engines now throttling back to 72% of rated performance, going in the bucket, reducing the stress on the shuttle as it goes supersonic. Discovery already 5 miles in altitude, 8.5 miles downrange, traveling almost 1,000 miles an hour.
Discovery, Houston, go with throttle up.
Roger, go and throttle up.
The throttle up call acknowledged by Commander Mark Kelly, joined on the flight deck by pilot Ken Ham, flight engineer Ron Guerin, and mission specialist Karen Nyberg. Down on the middeck are Mike Fossum, Aki Hoshide, and Greg Shamatov, heading for a half year on the International Space Station. One minute, 45 seconds into the flight. Discovery 22 miles in altitude, 23 miles downrange, standing by for solid rocket booster separation.
Copy staging.
Booster officer confirms staging, a good solid rocket booster separation.
Liquid hydrogen replenish of the external tank is now being terminated. T-minus 1 minute, 40 seconds and counting. All systems are go. About 90 seconds from the launch of Shuttle Endeavour.
30 seconds.
T-minus 1 minute, 10 seconds. T-minus 1 minute and counting. The ground launch sequencer will verify that the 3 main engines are ready to start. The booster joint heaters are being deactivated at this time. T-minus 50 seconds. We're transferring to orbital internal power. Endeavour is now running off of its 3 onboard fuel cells. Coming up on a go for auto sequence start at T-minus 31 seconds.
TLS is go for auto sequence start.
T-minus 27 seconds and counting. Endeavour's onboard computers have primary control of all the vehicle's critical functions. T-minus 18 seconds.
15.
The sound suppression water system has been activated, protecting Endeavour and the launch pad from acoustical energy. We're go for main engine start. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1. Booster ignition and liftoff of Endeavour, completing Kibo and fulfilling Japan's hope for an out-of-this-world space laboratory.
Houston, Endeavour, roll program.
Roger, roll, Endeavour.
This is Mission Control Houston. Endeavour's roll maneuver is being completed. It is now Going into a heads-down position on track for its flight to the International Space Station. Flying at 400 miles per hour, 1 mile in altitude and 7 miles downrange already from the Kennedy Space Center. Endeavour's engines were throttling down as the orbiter passes through the area of maximum pressure on the vehicle, now 50 seconds into the flight.
Endeavour, go at throttle up.
Go at throttle up.
The 3 engines on board are throttling back up. Endeavour flying at 1,100 miles per hour, 10 miles in altitude, and 10 miles downrange. At liftoff, the fully fueled shuttle, boosters, and external tank weighed 4.5 million pounds. The total thrust at launch was 6,425,000 pounds. 1 minute 33 seconds into the flight, Endeavour flying at 1,900 miles per hour, 17 miles in altitude, and 16 miles downrange. All systems continue to function well. Endeavour has 3 good main engines, 3 good power generating fuel cells, and 3 good auxiliary power units for the hydraulic system. We'll be standing by for burnout and separation of the solid rocket boosters. Combined, the twin boosters provide 5.3 million pounds of thrust to propel the orbiter towards space. The booster officer confirms the SRBs, or solid rocket boosters, have separated. 2 minutes and 20 seconds into the flight. Endeavour flying at 3,100 miles per hour, 37 miles in altitude, and 51 miles downrange.
Endeavour, 2-engine Marone.
2-engine Marone.
Roman, on L1, we'd like high-load duct heater to Alpha Slant Bravo.
Complete.
Copy.
Commander Mark Polanski adjusting a heater on the environmental control and life support system. Endeavour can reach Marone in the event of a single engine failure. However, all 3 main engines are still operating well. Now 3 minutes 20 seconds into the flight. Endeavour is flying at 4,000 miles per hour. Booster officer confirms that all 3 engines are performing well. Endeavour at an altitude of 56 statute miles and 120 miles downrange from the Kennedy Space Center.
Endeavour, negative return.
Negative return.
Roman, the extra duct heaters were because we saw a little cooling in the ducts.
Copy.
Now 4 minutes and 18 seconds into the flight, Endeavour is now flying too high and too fast to return to the Kennedy Space Center and the Space Shuttle landing facility in the event of an engine failure. All 3 Space Shuttle main engines continue to function well. The environmental systems officer also confirmed that the flash evaporator system has been activated to provide cooling before the payload bay doors are open in orbit.
Endeavour, press to ATO. Select Zaragoza.
Press to ATO, select Zaragoza.
Now 5 minutes and 22 seconds into the flight, Endeavour could now reach a lower than planned orbit, but a safe orbit on 2 engines should one fail. All 3 engines are still operating well.
Endeavour, single engine ops 3.
Single engine ops 3.
Endeavour could conduct a transatlantic abort landing on 1 engine should 2 fail at this point, all 3 continuing to perform well. Endeavour is flying at 8,300 miles per hour, 67 miles in altitude, 350 miles downrange. Endeavour's engines have been commanded to swivel to put the orbiter in the proper heads-up position. That for communications with the tracking and data relay satellites.
Endeavour, press to MECO.
Press to MECO.
And single engine Zaragoza 104.
Single engine Zaragoza 104.
6 minutes, 30 seconds. That call about press to MECO.
Nominal shutdown plan. Go for the plus X. Go for the pitch.
Copy, nominal shutdown. Go plus X. Go pitch.
Endeavour can reach the planned orbit on 2 engines, however all 3 continuing to perform well. And the shutdown plan of those engines is nominal, as Capcom Alan Poindexter indicated to Commander Mark Polanski.
Endeavour, single engine press 104.
Single engine press 104.
7 minutes and 12 seconds into the flight, Endeavour can reach its planned orbit on 1 engine should 2 fail, and all 3 are continuing to perform well. Endeavour is flying at 12,700 miles per hour, 65 miles in altitude, and 613 miles downrange from the Kennedy Space Center. 7 minutes, 35 seconds into the flight, and the engines are throttling down to maintain structural limits on the orbiter as it passes or approaches loads near 3 times gravity. Eight minutes, 31 seconds into the flight, booster officer confirms the main engine cutoff. And external tank separation is confirmed. Endeavour and its STS-127 crew in orbit, continuing on the mission to the International Space Station.
Nominal MECO, ohms 1, not required.
Endeavour copies. CLS's go for auto sequence start.
And we have a go for auto sequence start. Discovery's onboard computers have primary control of all the vehicle's critical functions.
20.
T-minus 20 seconds. T-minus 15 seconds. The sound suppression water system has been activated.
10. CLS's go for main engine start.
We have a go for main engine start. Main engine start. 2, 1. Booster ignition and liftoff of Discovery, celebrating its 25th birthday by racking up science and supplies to the space station.
Houston now controlling the midnight ride of Rick Sturckow and his crew to the International Space Station. Discovery rolling onto the proper alignment for its 8.5-minute ride to orbit. 4.5 million pounds of hardware and humans taking aim on the International Outpost. 52 seconds into the flight. The 3 liquid fuel main engines soon will throttle back to 72% of rated performance down in the bucket, reducing the stress on the shuttle as it goes transonic. Discovery 3.5 miles in altitude, 4 miles downrange from the Kennedy Space Center. Standing by for the throttle up call now from Capcom Eric Bowe.
Discovery. Copy, go ahead, throttle up.
The throttle up call acknowledged by Commander Rick Sturko, joined on the flight deck by pilot Kevin Ford, flight engineer Jose Hernandez, and Pat Forrester. Seated down on the middeck are Danny Olivas, Christopher Fugelsang of the European Space Agency, and Nicole Stott, hitching a ride for 3 months on the International Space Station. 1 minute 30 seconds into the flight. All of Discovery's systems performing normally, 17 miles in altitude, 18 miles downrange from the Kennedy Space Center. One minute 50 seconds into the flight, standing by for solid rocket booster separation. Booster officer confirms staging a good solid rocket booster separation. Guidance now converging, the onboard computers steering the shuttle for its precise path to the International Space Station. Discovery 37 miles in altitude, 54 miles downrange from the Kennedy Space Center. 3 good main engines. 3 good auxiliary power units, 3 good fuel cells.
Discovery, 2-engine Maroon. Copy, 2-engine Maroon.
Three minutes into the flight, everything going very well for Discovery, 47 miles in altitude, 85 miles downrange. The orbital maneuvering system engines ignited, Discovery kicking on the afterburners for 1 minute 52 seconds, assisting the shuttle and its crew on their climb to orbit. Discovery flying on the singular power of its 3 liquid fuel main engines, draining 0.5 ton of fuel per second from the shuttle's large fuel tank. Discovery coming up on the point of negative return, where the shuttle will be too far downrange, too high in altitude to return to the launch site in the event of an engine failure.
Discovery, negative return. Copy, Houston, negative return.
Discovery speeding straight as an arrow on its night flight toward a date with the International Space Station Sunday night. 4 minutes, 8 seconds into the flight, Discovery 61 miles in altitude, 163 miles downrange from the Cape. All systems in great shape. More than halfway toward its preliminary orbit, Discovery's engines, fuel cells, and auxiliary power units performing as advertised. Discovery now 212 miles downrange from the Kennedy Space Center. The Environmental Systems Officer reports the activation of a good flash evaporator system providing cooling for Discovery's avionics until the payload bay doors are open an hour and a half into the flight. 5 minutes into the ascent toward orbit. This view from a camera on the external fuel tank.
Discovery, press to ATO, select Istris. Press to ATO will select Istris.
That call from Capcom Eric Bowe indicating that Discovery can make minimal abort to orbit targets in the event of an engine failure. However, all 3 main engines continue to perform perfectly.
Discovery, single engine, Ops 3.
Copy, single engine, Ops 3.
Discovery now 336 miles downrange from the Kennedy Space Center, coming up on the 6-minute mark into the flight. The guidance officer and mission control confirming that Discovery's computers have commanded the main engines to swivel again, enabling the shuttle to roll to a heads-up position above the fuel tank, gaining more favorable communications through the tracking and data relay satellite system as it heads uphill.
Single engine, Istris, 104.
Discovery, roger.
And Discovery, press to MECO.
Roger, press to MECO.
That call from Capcom Eric Bowe indicating that Discovery can make normal main engine cutoff targets in the event of an engine failure. However, 6.5 minutes into the flight, all 3 main engines performing normally. Discovery now 466 miles downrange from the Kennedy Space Center. Less than 2 minutes of powered flight remaining.
Discovery, single engine, press 104, nominal shutdown plan, go for the 20-second plus X, no go to pitch.
Discovery, copy all, 20-second plus X, no go to pitch.
The 20-second plus X referred to by Capcom Eric Bowe is the maneuver that Commander Rick Sturckow will perform after external tank separation, enabling umbilical well cameras to obtain flash photography of the fuel tank as it drifts away. 7.5 minutes into the flight, the main engine's being throttled down to limit the stress on the shuttle and its 7 crew members to that of 3 times the effect of gravity. Discovery currently traveling at a speed of more than 4 miles per second. Discovery and its crew 700 miles downrange from the Kennedy Space Center. 40 seconds of powered flight remaining. Standing by now for main engine cutoff. That will be followed a few seconds later by the separation of the external fuel tank. Booster officer confirms a good main engine cutoff. Now standing by for external tank separation. External tank separation confirmed. Discovery now in its preliminary orbit. You can see the flash photography as Discovery fades away from the camera view. Good maneuver being commanded by Rick Sturckow, maneuvering Discovery so that those cameras embedded in the umbilical well can perform that flash photography of the discarded external fuel tank. An uneventful ride to orbit for the Shuttle Discovery, 2 days shy of its 25th anniversary of its maiden flight, beginning a 13-day mission.
Discovery, nominal MECO, OMS 1 is not required.
Discovery, roger. A minute, 30 seconds.
Sound suppression water system now being armed for release. Confirmation we have 3 main engines ready for ignition.
One minute.
Space Shuttle now on internal power. Liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen fill and drain valves are closed. Solid rocket booster flight data recorders are activated.
And the handoff to Atlantis's onboard computers. Atlantis now in control of the countdown.
20.
Firing chain is armed. Sound suppression water system activated. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 3, 2, 1, 0. And liftoff of Space Shuttle Atlantis on a mission to build, resupply, and to do research on the International Space Station.
Houston now controlling. Atlantis begins its penultimate journey to shore up the International Space Station. Atlantis now in the proper alignment for its 8.5-minute ride to orbit. 4.5 million pounds of hardware and humans taking aim on the International Outpost. 30 seconds into the flight. Atlantis almost 2 miles in altitude, almost 6 miles downrange from the Kennedy Space Center already, traveling 500 miles an hour. The 3 liquid fuel main engines now throttling back to 72% of rated performance, going into the bucket, reducing the stress on the shuttle as it breaks through the sound barrier. 55 seconds into the flight, all systems operating normally, 900 miles an hour. The speed of Atlantis right now, 6 miles in altitude, 9 miles downrange.
Atlantis, go with throttle up.
Copy, go with throttle up.
The throttle up call acknowledged by Commander Charlie Hobaugh, joined on the flight deck by pilot Butch Wilmore, flight engineer Randy Bresnick, and Leland Melvin. Seated down on the middeck are Mike Foreman and Bobby Satcher, kicking off their work week with a Monday commute to orbit. 1 minute, 30 seconds into the flight. Atlantis 13 miles in altitude, 15 miles downrange, traveling almost 2,000 miles an hour. Three good auxiliary power units, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good main engines. One minute, 50 seconds into the flight. 10 seconds away from solid rocket booster separation. Booster officer confirms staging a good solid rocket booster separation. Guidance now converging. Atlantis steering into the center lane of Highway 129 en route to the International Space Station. 2 minutes, 20 seconds into the flight, 34 miles in altitude, 48 miles downrange. Atlantis traveling 3,200 miles an hour. The propulsion officer in mission control reports that the orbital maneuvering system engines have ignited. Atlantis kicking on the afterburners.
Copy, 2 engine down.
Atlantis flying on the singular power of its 3 liquid fuel main engines, draining about a half a ton of fuel per second from the large fuel tank. Coming up on the 3-minute mark into the flight, Atlantis 46 miles in altitude, 81 miles downrange, traveling almost 4,000 miles an hour. Atlantis speeding straight as an arrow toward its date with the International Space Station Wednesday morning. Three and a half minutes into the flight, all of Atlantis' systems functioning by the book. 55 miles in altitude, 120 miles downrange, traveling almost 5,000 miles an hour.
Atlantis, negative return.
Atlantis copies, negative return.
Atlantis now too far downrange, too high in altitude to return to the launch site in the event of an engine failure. All 3 engines performing perfectly. 4 minutes, 20 seconds into the flight. Atlantis now 62 miles in altitude, 180 miles downrange, traveling almost 6,000 miles an hour. All systems performing normally. Atlantis on course, on track for its preliminary orbit. The Environmental Systems Officer reports a good flash evaporator system activated for Atlantis, providing cooling for the shuttle's avionics until the payload bay doors are opened about an hour and a half into the flight.
Atlantis, press to ATO.
Copy, press to ATO.
That call up from Capcom Chris Ferguson indicating that Atlantis can now make minimal orbital altitude targets in the event of an engine failure. However, all three engines continue to perform normally, as do the auxiliary power units and the three power-producing fuel cells. 5.5 minutes into the flight, Atlantis now 67 miles in altitude, 312 miles downrange, traveling almost 8,000 miles an hour.
Thanks for single engine ops 3.
Atlantis now beginning to roll to a heads-up position, the main engine swiveling, enabling the shuttle to move to a heads-up position above its fuel tank, gaining more favorable communications through the tracking and data relay satellite system as it heads uphill.
Atlantis, press to MECO, single engine Zaragoza 104.
Press to MECO, single engine Zaragoza 104.
That call from Capcom Chris Ferguson to Commander Charlie Hobaugh indicating that Atlantis can make normal orbital cutoff targets in the event of an engine failure.
Go for the pitch.
Okay, nominal shutdown, go for plus X, go for the pitch.
Now 6 minutes 45 seconds into the flight. Atlantis 66 miles in altitude, almost 500 miles downrange from the Kennedy Space Center, traveling almost 11,000 miles an hour. 90 seconds left in powered flight.
Atlantis, single engine press 104.
Single engine press 104.
Coming up on the 7.5 minute mark into the flight, the main engines will once again be throttled down to limit the stress on the shuttle and its 6 crew members to that of 3 times the effect of gravity. Atlantis approaching a speed of more than 4 miles a second. At the time of main engine cutoff a minute from now, Atlantis will enter its preliminary orbit at a speed of 5 miles a second. Seven minutes, 40 seconds into the flight. Atlantis providing 8 minutes, 10 seconds into the flight. Standing by for main engine cutoff. Main engine cutoff confirmed by the booster officer, standing by for external tank separation. And the bird's eye view from the external tank camera of external tank separation. Atlantis now in its preliminary orbit. Commander Charlie Hobaugh will now maneuver Atlantis so that cameras embedded in the shuttle's umbilical well can perform photography of the discarded external fuel tank. And Mike Foreman and Leland Melvin are about to use digital still and video cameras to capture handheld imagery of the tank for downlink a few hours from now. A flawless climb to orbit for the shuttle Atlantis and its 6 crew members en route now to the International Space Station.
MECO ohms 1 is not required. Fergie will meet you in the post ohms 1.
And we'll see you there, Scorch.
Hey, Fergie, for Tom.
Go ahead.
1 minute.
Ground launch sequencer will hand off to Atlantis' onboard flight computers at T-minus 31 seconds. About 15 seconds from now. Solid rocket booster flight data recorders are activated. T-minus 31 seconds. The handoff has occurred.
25.
Solid rocket booster nozzle gimbal check. Firing chain is armed. Sound suppression water system activated. T-minus 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8. Go for main engine start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And 0 and liftoff of Space Shuttle Atlantis, reaching the crest of its historic achievements in space.
Houston, Atlantis is in a roll.
Roger, roll.
Houston is now controlling. The roll maneuver is complete. Atlantis is in a heads-down position on course for a 51.6 degree, 136 by 36 statute mile orbit. The three main engines on Atlantis have now been throttled down to 72% of rated thrust as the orbiter prepares to pass through the area of maximum dynamic pressure on the vehicle in the lower atmosphere. The engine's now beginning to throttle back up.
Atlantis, you are go at throttle up.
Copy, go, throttle up.
All three engines looking really good, back at full throttle now at liftoff. The fully fueled shuttle, boosters, and external tank weighed 4.5 million pounds. It now has burned half of that liftoff weight in propellant. 1 minute, 30 seconds into the flight, all three auxiliary power units that provide hydraulic power to the orbiter's systems in good shape, as are the fuel cells providing electricity to all of the systems on board. Atlantis is already 19 miles in altitude, downrange from the Kennedy Space Center, 20 miles, traveling 2,500 miles per hour. Coming up on staging, the point at which the twin solid rocket boosters burn out and separate from the orbiter. Booster separation confirmed. The onboard guidance system has done its job of settling out any of the dispersions that have been introduced at the booster separation. Atlantis' performance thus far is exactly as planned as Atlantis heads into orbit, flying heads down, wings level into a historic sunset on its 30-second mission.
Atlantis, you are 2-engine TOW.
Copy, 2-engine TOW.
Atlantis can now reach Zaragoza in Spain in the event of a single-engine failure. However, all three main engines are still operating at full throttle, 104% of rated thrust. The auxiliary power unit still in great shape, as are the fuel cells. Atlantis is traveling 3,700 miles per hour at an altitude of 47 miles, downrange from the Kennedy Space Center now 88 miles. Atlantis is getting a boost from the orbital maneuvering system engines on the tail of the vehicle. Those have been burning now for about 1.5 minutes.
Atlantis, you are negative return.
Copy, Scorch. Negative return.
Negative return means Atlantis can no longer return to the Kennedy Space Center in the event of an engine failure. It's already traveling too high and too fast to return to the launch site. Now traveling 6 miles per hour, 180 miles from the Kennedy Space Center at an altitude of 62 miles, or about 330,000 feet. This view from a camera on the external tank looking down the length of the orbiter as Atlantis heads into orbit on its 32nd voyage into space.
Atlantis, you are pressed to ATO.
Copy, press to ATO.
Atlantis can reach orbit on 2 engines should one fail at this point. However, all 3 are still in great shape. I've got a report that the flash evaporator system providing cooling to all of the systems is also operating normally as well. Atlantis is traveling 7,700 miles per hour, 278 miles downrange, 67 miles out in altitude.
Atlantis, you are single engine Ops 3.
Copy, single engine Ops 3.
Standing by for the guidance system to take over control of Atlantis and roll the vehicle to a heads-up position. This roll to heads-up allows for...
Atlantis, you are pressed to MECO and single engine Zaragoza 104.
Copy, press to MECO, single engine Zaragoza 104.
Atlantis can reach a safe orbit on 2 engines now.
Lucky dog.
That reference to the guidance system's choice of the roll maneuver.
Have a nominal shutdown on all 3. You will be go for the plus X, go for the pitch.
Atlantis copies, nominal shutdown, go for the plus X, go for the pitch.
Good readback.
And that roll to heads up provides a good satellite communications link with Atlantis, continuing its travel into space, approaching 7 minutes into the flight.
Atlantis, you are single engine press 104.
Copy, single engine press 104.
Atlantis can reach orbit on 1 engine now should 2 fail. However, all 3 are still in good shape. Atlantis is now traveling 13,000 miles per hour, 580 miles away from the Kennedy Space Center at an altitude of 340,000 feet, or about 64 miles. Shortly, the 3 main engines will begin throttling back to maintain the structural limits on the orbiter as it approaches loads near 3 times gravity. All quiet here in Mission Control with all systems in great shape. Atlantis is traveling 15,500 miles per hour, approaching 8 minutes into the flight, downrange 740 miles at an altitude of 64 miles, 337,000 feet. Standing by for main engine cutoff confirmation as Atlantis is in excellent shape heading into orbit. Main engine cutoff confirmed, standing by for separation from the external fuel tank. Atlantis now flying away from the external tank after separation. plus X burn maneuver being performed by Commander Ken Ham.
Nominal MECO, OMS 1 not required. Preliminary OMS 2 TIG will be 37:30. We'll meet you in the post-OMS 1 procedure, and welcome back to space for you and your veteran crew.
Copy, 37:30. It's good to be back, Scorch, as you know. And OMS 1 is not required.
Good read.
Hello?
T-minus 4 minutes and counting.
USS go for purge sequence 4.
The final helium purge of the 3 main engines is underway in preparation for main engine start.
Go for Captain comes in T0. Range status is go for launch. And what is your status?
We are go.
Copy.
Final test of the flight control surfaces is underway. This is a pre-programmed pattern of movements designed to verify the readiness of the flight control surfaces, the elevons, speed brakes, and rudder. Minus 3 minutes and 30 seconds and counting. Final aero surface checks are complete. Discovery's 3 main engines will be gimbaled through a pre-programmed series of maneuvers as a final test before launch. T-minus 3 minutes and counting. Final pressurization of the external tank's liquid oxygen tank is underway.
Go for ET LO2 pressurization.
And we're completing purge of the shuttle main engines.
TLT OTC, clear caution warning memory, verify no unexpected errors.
TLT in work. OTC, TLT, no unexpected errors.
The gaseous oxygen vent hood, or beanie cap, is slowly being retracted away from the top of the external tank.
Close and lock your visors and initiate O2 flow.
Copy on work.
Orbiter test conductor John Craxton requesting pilot Eric Bowe clear the caution and warning memory system. T-minus 2 minutes and counting.
GLS is go for ET LH2 pressurization.
Liquid hydrogen replenish on the external tank is being terminated as planned. T-minus 1 minute, 30 seconds and counting. All systems are go. About 90 seconds away from the launch of Space Shuttle Discovery on her final mission. T-minus 1 minute, 10 seconds and counting. The liquid hydrogen tank inside the external tank is now at the proper flight pressure. T-minus 1 minute and counting. The ground launch sequencer will verify that the 3 main engines are ready to start. The booster joint heaters are being deactivated at this time. T-minus 48 seconds and we're transferring to orbiter internal power. Discovery is now running on its 3 onboard fuel cells. Coming up on a go for auto sequence start at T-minus 31 seconds.
GLS is go for auto sequence start.
And we have a go for auto sequence start. Discovery's onboard computers have primary control of all the vehicle's critical functions. 20 seconds. The sound suppression water system has been activated, protecting Discovery and the launch pad from acoustical energy waves. Go for main engine start. We have main engine start. 2, 1. Booster ignition and the final liftoff of Discovery. A tribute to the dedication, hard work, and pride of America's Space Shuttle team. The shuttle has cleared the tower.
This is Mission Control in Houston. The Space Shuttle now rolling over onto its back for the 8.5-minute ride into orbit. Discovery now making one last reach for the stars. Discovery's engines are now throttling down as the orbiter passes through the area of maximum pressure, reducing the stress on the shuttle as it goes supersonic.
Discovery Houston, you are go at throttle up.
Commander Steve Lindsay acknowledging the call from Capcom Charlie Hoba as Discovery's 3 main engines throttle back up. Lindsay is joined on the flight deck by pilot Eric Bowen, mission specialist Al Drew, and Nicole Stott. Mission specialist Mike Barrett and Steve Bowen. Discovery's 3 main engines are burning fuel at a rate that would drain an average swimming pool in about 25 seconds. The engines, combined with the solid rocket boosters, produce more than 7 million pounds of thrust. 1 minute, 50 seconds into the flight, we're standing by for separation of the twin solid rocket boosters. Discovery now traveling 2,695 miles an hour. Its altitude 24 miles. Downrange from the Kennedy Space Center 29 miles. Booster separation confirmed. Discovery's guidance is now converging as the shuttle's onboard computers fine-tune the flight. Two minutes, 25 seconds into the flight, Discovery traveling 3,189 miles an hour. Its altitude 37 miles. Downrange from the Kennedy Space Center 53 miles. Discovery now getting a boost into orbit from its twin orbital maneuvering system engines on either side of the shuttle's tail. These 2 engines will burn for 2 minutes and 32 seconds.